Hello again, I am Blunty. Let's talk about graphics. Fidelity versus frame rate, immersion versus gameplay, look versus feel, all that kind of stuff. We always have this kind of debate about every game that ever gets announced or released, or at least has a teaser trailer put out for it. Graphics is one of the first things we discuss or argue about because it's one of the first things we're presented with. But while that kind of debate is usually, for me at least, quite boring, it's just the same things being said back and forth that has been said for decades of gaming now, and nothing really interesting or new or insightful is ever mentioned. It's just fanboys whining at each other for the sake of whining because they've got nothing else to do until the game comes out. The situation changes a bit with Monster Hunter Rise, the upcoming release for the Nintendo Switch, because what's happening in the Monster Hunter community is one of the more interesting versions of that debate that has ever happened because of the very particular way the Monster Hunter Rise player base and fan base has developed over the years. You see, because much like Pokemon, Monster Hunter has never been the best looking game in any generation it's ever been, on any platform it's ever been on. Much like Pokemon, it was gameplay first, graphics second. However, with the game's most popular release, and a release that brought millions, literally millions upon millions upon millions of new players to the Monster Hunter franchise, and exposed the franchise as a whole to the Western audience in a way it never has been before, it was unusually graphically pretty and well presented. So let's talk about how that happened, why that happened, and the arguments that it's causing within the Monster Hunter community, and who is right. Just kidding. Nobody's right. Everyone's entitled to their own opinions about this. But let's dig down into it, because like I said, it is one of the more interesting versions of this debate that we've ever had. Personally, I've been loving the feel and flow of combat in the Monster Hunter Rise demo we currently have access to. The mobility options new to the series with this title feel great. The monsters look and animate great. The hunters with their wonderfully over-the-top anime-style armor and hilariously impractically huge weapons. It's just a blast. It's fun. But I'm a relative Monster Hunter noob. I tried Monster Hunter World when it first came out on PC, but I struggled to latch onto it, and after only about 25 hours or so, I bounced off it completely at a paltry hunter level of 9. So I will say for you veterans watching my gameplay, don't judge me too harshly on that. I'm still learning. But I only ever went back to Monster Hunter World as a tool for benchmarking GPU performance in my hardware reviews, a purpose for which it was, and actually still is, great even today because it can still push hardware pretty hard. But I am legitimately very excited for Rise. Based on my limited and shallow experience with the demo so far, I've even pre-ordered it. But one thing did stick out to me. Monster Hunter Rise is a bit drab. Quite washed out by Monster Hunter standards as far as I've seen of the older games. It didn't immediately hit me, but on day one I did go to take a screenshot to use as a Twitter thumbnail for my Twitch livestream, and I was very quickly noticing that it was very hard to get a shot where my character was clearly separated from the background. Admittedly, I was using the hunting horn, and in the demo the preset armor for that is in fact the most colorless armor in the demo. But even by Nintendo Switch standards, the environments we see in the demo are not very impressive graphically. They're muddy, low-resolution textures, chunky geometry, and easily spotted repetition of small texture samples are amongst the easiest compromises to spot. Not to mention, it's not even running at native 1080p. Even in handheld mode, it's not reaching 720p native. Instead, this game does what most of its predecessors did. It reserves as much of the limited performance budget as it possibly can, not for the environment, but for the player character and the monsters. The player character being important because customizing your armor sets is one of the funner things in the game. You play the monster fashion game, and the monsters, of course, because, well, that's what you're fighting, that's what you're focusing on. You want the monsters to look glorious and impressive and wonderful and animate beautifully, and they do. But while this game makes a return to a slightly more stylized look and the more simply represented environments and effects, it seems to have kept the more muted and slightly desaturated look of Monster Hunter World. In fact, mechanically, long-time player opinion seems to be that the game itself is a complete blend between Monster Hunter World and the older Monster Hunter Generations title, which is a mix most seem happy with, losing some of the perceived fluff of World and bringing back some focus of Ultimate. I can't speak to that. As I said, World is the only Monster Hunter game I have any direct gameplay experience with in any real way. But as I've been showing you, for my own curiosity, I took some gameplay of Monster Hunter Rise. I used an AI upscaler on it for a boost of crispness and detail and kicked it all the way up to 4K, and the result looked immediately better, of course. Then I kicked the dingles out of the saturation, boosted the color, gave shadows a little kick down to goose the contrast, and bam, I got that, which I really quite liked. So it's not so much the muddy textures in the environment that bother me. I agree with their choices here for the most part. The detail of the monster and the hunter are far, far more important than making the grass look nice or the rocks look pretty or flowers look more flowery. And it is of course super important that for gameplay like this and combat mechanics like this, which for many styles of combat rely heavily on very precise timings and inputs and reaction times for high level gameplay performance, that a very stable frame rate is maintained, even if that stable frame rate is just 30 FPS. For this kind of game, I would much rather a locked 30 FPS than floating between sort of mid-20s and 45. But while I've never played them, I've seen the older games in action, and the older games in the series were very bright and highly saturated by comparison to this. Monster Hunter World, where I first met this series, a bit less so. But it had an unusually high graphical fidelity and a slightly more grounded and realistic graphical style to help make up for that. It was in fact quite an outlier as far as presentation of Monster Hunter games goes. And like I alluded to in the opening, within the Monster Hunter community itself, there is a bit of a divide happening on whether or not these graphics on Switch and the stylistic choices are good or bad. But to get there, we have to trace a little history which will explain why battle lines are being drawn between old school longtime fans and a newer breed of Hunter-come-latelys. So, by the time Rise launches, Monster Hunter series itself will be 17 years old, and in that time, not counting spin-off games that drastically diverged from the core gameplay mechanics, there's been 12 releases. Although within those 12 releases, it gets a bit muddy about what counts as an actual release, because about half of those were remakes or conversions or platform ports and whatnot. It gets quite confusing for a Monster Hunter outsider like me to keep track of. I mean, hell, I've been nipple-deep in Pokemon for nearly a quarter of a century, and even within the familiar situation of that series releases, I get confused and turned around sometimes about what came when and why and how and which one was which. But however you count and divide the generational releases of Monster Hunter, one thing is clear. While its best-selling versions for most of the history have in fact been the various portable, handheld hardware platforms, driven largely by its popularity in Japan, and the Japanese of course being strong adopters of portable gaming for a long time now, meaning that for most of its history, the favoured versions of Monster Hunter have been, by nature, graphically compromised and performance limited, because they're on handhelds. But then came Monster Hunter World, designed for home consoles and PC platforms, and was such a massive success it sold more than 3 times as well as the next best-selling game in the series' entire history. Even Iceborne, not a separate game at all, but an expansion for Monster Hunter World, sold nearly 35% more copies than the next best-selling title in the series, which was a completely standalone full game. The expansion sold more than the next best-selling full game. That tells you how popular Monster Hunter World was. And World changed a few things about core Monster Hunter, and was initially a bit controversial for it, in fact, amongst older players. And amongst other things, it was called the most accessible Monster Hunter game ever. The notoriously punishing and difficult game series was made easier for single-player play. A lot of the mechanics in combat were streamlined, made more fluid and easier to pick up for newbies, all in service of trying to expand the fan base and the player base. And obviously, it worked. But rather less controversially, it was very, very nice looking. Moving from a focus on portable play to accessing the full power of even PC play made a huge difference in presentation fidelity and even stylistic choices that the developers were making. A little more realistic and a little less bright and anime. And not all old-school Monster Hunter players reacted positively to these changes, at first at least. But it did work. The game was a massive success. Before World, Monster Hunter, as far as the average Western gamer was concerned, if they knew about the series at all, was largely considered a little niche Japanese game with a relatively small cult following in the West. And sure enough, even the very best-selling Monster Hunter game sold millions fewer copies than the worst-selling title in the core Pokemon series, for comparison, coming back to that. And Monster Hunter World was the Monster Hunter game that brought the series into the view of the larger gaming audience, at least in the West. with more than 16 million sales of the base version of Monster Hunter World, which in fact puts it on par with some of the more popular entries in the Pokemon series as far as sales went. Monster Hunter was, after a decade and a half, finally front and center stage under a spotlight, and for the first time a game many of its hardcore players could mention without their friends going, "Oh, Monster Hunter? What's that?" And that all means a huge chunk of the current player base and huge chunks of the potential returning player base for Monster Hunter Rise started their love of this series with Monster Hunter World, an outlier as far as graphical presentation goes. A beautiful, high-fidelity, richly detailed and somewhat more stylistically grounded presentation of the game's environments, monsters and player characters than most of the series has ever been. And while on the consoles it was stuck at 30 FPS, although at launch it was notorious for performing very poorly at times, struggling to get out of the frame rates in the mid-20s at time, even on the PlayStation 4, it also means quite a few PC players were enjoying it flowing at 60 FPS, or 120 FPS, or 144 FPS, or just uncapped completely and letting their hardware go wild on it. Which finally brings us back around to Monster Hunter Rise. Its looming release in a couple of months is exclusive to the Nintendo Switch, although there's some evidence floating about out there that it may eventually also see a PC release. Fingers crossed on that at least. And as the short and limited demo currently available to give players a chance to experience the look, feel, and flow of the game reveals, it's, by basic need of the Switch's rather more limited performance budgets, is back to a more simplistic presentation of its environments and a 30 FPS cap. And unlike World's launch on consoles, it at least looks to be pretty well nailed there, as I explored in a previous video I made about performance specifically. I did make the mistake, however, of recording the Monster Hunter World gameplay for this video immediately before I recorded the Rise gameplay for this video, which made immediately jumping from the 4K 60 FPS experience to a low-res 30 FPS experience a lot more jarring than it usually is. My eyes went a bit wibbly for a while there, I have to admit to you. But with fidelity and frame rate at least satisfactory, or at the very least gameplay servicing levels, it's that color and contrast tweak that make the biggest difference for me. It helps the muddier graphics pop out a bit, it helps the color of the armors and monsters visually separate a bit more, making situational awareness during battle a bit easier, and the game feel more seamless in combat. Luckily, this change could be easy for Capcom to implement before release. Unluckily, it's pretty much too late into development for that to happen. The art style and presentation have long since been decided upon and locked down in a boardroom somewhere, so it's very unlikely we will see it change. Luckily, if the rumors about an eventual PC release are true, not only will we see high-resolution textures, smoother geometry, and higher frame rates, but even if they don't boost the colors and saturation and contrast by default, on PC we can do that ourselves, either with mods or just by using something like the built-in real-time filters that Nvidia have in their drivers. But that's a maybe, and that's a maybe that's a long way off, if ever. The PC version isn't much more than rumors based around a document found in a hack on Capcom last year at this point. So back to the only real version of the game we know about, the Nintendo Switch version. I guess you could apply some basic color correction using your TV's inbuilt controls, but that's a long way from being ideal. And when you do use that kind of stuff on your TV, sometimes it introduces extra lag as it does the processing anyway. That's why a lot of TVs these days come with game modes. The game mode doesn't do anything special, it just turns off all the extra processing, so it's just a raw feed so you get the best latency possible. Still though, what do you think? What do you think made the biggest difference in those changes? The AI upscaling I did, was that the biggest, oh, that could look much better, or was it just the color? Because I think it's just the color. I can put up with the muddy textures. I can put up with the environments looking, a generation and a half behind or more. That's fine, as long as the game feels good to play, and it does feel good to play. But I think with the extra color messing I did, just to help things sort of, separate out a bit more, I think it could make a big difference. So, I don't know, fingers crossed that's some feedback that Capcom have been getting across the board, and it is possible they could implement that before release, before they go to release, before they start saving the code to game carts and sending it out, or preparing a day one patch or whatnot to give that extra kick. It's possible. Unlikely, but possible. But with that, I would like to thank you very much for watching. Hopefully somewhere along the way you did the thing with the thumbs and the comments and the sub and the bell and all that sort of stuff to help me out with that algorithm. I am Blunty. We'll catch you next time, as thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there whose above and beyond support make a wonderful difference, just spiritually. Just thank you. It means so much. Just throwing, hey, I like your content, here's a little bit of money. Here's $2, here's $5, here's $10. Nobody's taken up the $50 option once.